Think about the last time you saw those three letters. FBI. Maybe it was the warning card before a movie. Maybe it was a badge flashed in the cold open of a crime show. Either way, you didn't question it. Of course, America has a national police force. It feels as permanent as the flag. Here's the thing. For the first 132 years of the United States as an independent nation, there was no FBI, no federal detectives, no national crime lab, no G-men. None. And yet somehow, counterfeiters were hunted down, corrupt senators were dragged into courtrooms, and train robbers were chased across half a continent. The country didn't collapse into lawlessness. Crimes got investigated, which raises an obvious question. By whom? If a gang robbed a bank in Missouri and rode into Kansas, who followed them? If a United States senator was selling his vote, who was allowed to look into it? If a third of the money in your pocket might be fake, and at one point it genuinely might have been, whose job was it to fix that? This isn't trivia. What happened in 1908 fundamentally rewired the relationship between the American citizen and the federal government, and it created a question we're still fighting about right now, every election cycle. Who investigates the investigators? The answer is a strange, violent, occasionally absurd journey through a formerly enslaved lawman with 3,000 arrests to his name, a private detective empire that answered to no voter, a bomb thrown into Jesse James's mother's kitchen, an era when much of America's money was counterfeit, and a founding father of federal policing who happened to be the grandnephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. So let me take you back to the beginning, September 1789. The United States government is a few months old, and it has a problem that sounds almost like a joke. Congress has just created federal courts, it has written federal laws, and it has hired almost nobody to enforce any of them. On September 24, 1789, President Washington signed the Judiciary Act, which organized the country into judicial districts and created, for each one, a single officer called a United States Marshal, 13 districts, 13 marshals, each allowed to hire a handful of deputies. That was it. That was the entire enforcement arm of the federal government of the United States. Do the math on that. The first census counted just under 4 million Americans. 13 marshals works out to roughly one federal officer for every 300,000 people, the equivalent of policing the entire city of Pittsburgh with one man and his part-time helpers. Today, the FBI alone employs around 38,000 people, verify current figure, and it's only one of dozens of federal agencies with a badge. Now, you might assume this was an oversight, a young government stretched thin that simply hadn't gotten around to building a police force yet. It wasn't. The founders knew exactly what they were doing. These were men who had grown up watching British soldiers enforce the law in the streets of Boston. General warrants, troops quartered in private homes, customs officers with nearly unlimited power to search. To the revolutionary generation, a national government with its own police was not a convenience. It was the single most recognizable feature of tyranny. Policing, they decided, would belong to the states, the counties, the towns. The federal government would get courts and a skeleton crew to serve their papers, and nothing more. And if you want to understand the nightmare scenario living rent-free in their heads, you only have to look across the Atlantic. Within a decade of the Judiciary Act, Napoleon's France would perfect the modern police state under his Minister of Police, Joseph Fouché, a man who ran networks of spies and informants so thorough that Parisians joked that when 3 people spoke in the street, one of them reported to Fouché. That, a government that watches its own citizens, was the thing America was built to never become. Hold on to that name, Fouché, and hold on to the name Bonaparte. Both are coming back at the end of this story in a way you will not believe. So who actually chased criminals in early America? Mostly your neighbors. Counties elected sheriffs, towns appointed constables and night watchmen. And when something big happened, the sheriff or the marshal could summon the posse comitatus, P-O-H-C comitatus, a Latin phrase meaning, roughly, the power of the county. In plain English, the legal authority to grab ordinary citizens, deputize them on the spot, and ride out. Law enforcement wasn't a profession. It was a chore, like jury duty with guns. The marshals themselves were less like detectives and more like general-purpose federal handymen. They served subpoenas, rented courtrooms, paid the judges' bills, guarded prisoners, and, in one of history's stranger job descriptions, they conducted the national census. For 80 years, the same men who hunted fugitives also knocked on doors counting children and chickens. And when the federal government's paperwork met the real world, it could get ugly fast. Picture David Lennox, the U.S. Marshal for Pennsylvania, in the summer of 1794, riding through the western counties to serve court summonses on farmers who hadn't paid the federal whiskey tax. These were armed men, in country where federal authority was about as welcome as smallpox. Within days of Lennox serving his writs, hundreds of angry militiamen besieged and burned the fortified home of the local tax inspector, and Lennox found himself detained by the very people he'd come to summon. It took an army of nearly 13,000 militia, personally accompanied by President Washington on horseback, to restore order. One marshal with a satchel of papers, 13,000 soldiers to back him up. That was the gap between federal law and federal power in early America. And yet, here's the surprising part, the skeleton crew mostly held. For 70 years, this bare-bones system muddled through, because most crime was local, and local institutions handled it. But the system had a moral rot at its center, and it's important to look at it directly. The single largest federal enforcement effort of the pre-Civil War era was not against robbers or smugglers. After the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, federal marshals were legally required to hunt down people escaping slavery and return them to bondage, and citizens who refused to help could be fined. In 1854, the arrest of one man, Anthony Burns, in Boston, required federal troops and Marines to hold back furious crowds, at a cost to the government estimated in the tens of thousands of dollars, verify figure, as 50,000 Bostonians lined streets draped in black to watch a single human being march to the ship carrying him back to slavery. Whatever else you take from this story, remember that America's first great experiment in federal enforcement was, for millions of people, the machinery of their oppression. The question, who enforces the law, has never been separate from the question, for whom? Then came the Civil War. And the war didn't just break the country, it broke the money. And that's where the trouble began. To pay for the war, the Union did something it had never done before. It printed federal paper money, the famous greenbacks, and a nation suddenly awash in unfamiliar paper was a counterfeiter's paradise. By the war's end, the Secret Service itself would later estimate that as much as 1/3 of all currency in circulation was fake. Verify fraction. This is the service's own commonly cited estimate. Stop and feel that number. Imagine getting paid on Friday, and 1 out of every 3 bills in the envelope is worthless. Imagine every shopkeeper in your town squinting at every note, every transaction carrying a silent coin flip of fraud. Counterfeiting wasn't a crime problem. It was a slow-motion attack on the idea that money meant anything at all. And it wasn't a few lone forgers in attics. It was an industry, with a supply chain a modern economist would recognize. Master engravers, skilled craftsmen who could have made honest livings, cut the plates. Wholesalers bought the fake bills in bulk at a fraction of face value, the way you'd buy any merchandise. And at the bottom were the shovers, the retail level of the operation, whose job was simply to walk into shops and pass the bad paper 1 bill at a time, ideally somewhere dim, ideally at closing time, ideally to a tired clerk. Some dealers openly mailed out price lists, selling $100 of counterfeit for a few real ones. Verify specifics of price list practice. Think of it as a shadow mint, running in parallel to the real one, and for a while, running nearly as fast. And there was no federal agency whose job it was to stop it. So on July 5, 1865, the Treasury Department quietly created one, the United States Secret Service. Its first chief was William P. Wood, simple as it looks, just Wood, the former keeper of Washington's old Capitol Prison, a man with the ethics of a riverboat gambler and a gift for thinking like the criminals he chased. Wood filled his new agency with reformed counterfeiters and streetwise operatives, men who could walk into an engraver's den and talk the language. Within about a year, his agents had rounded up more than 200 counterfeiters, verify count, and the epidemic began, slowly, to recede. But here's the critical detail most people overlook. The Secret Service was not a national police force. It belonged to the Treasury, and its mandate was money, counterfeiting, and later certain frauds against the government. It had no general authority to investigate murder, corruption, or anything else. Even the job we associate with it today, protecting the president, didn't come until after President McKinley was assassinated in 1901. The third president murdered in 36 years in a country that still couldn't quite bring itself to build a federal force to prevent it. Now, to be fair, the Secret Service wasn't entirely alone. But here's the detail that matters most for our story. Every scrap of federal investigative power that did exist was locked inside a silo. The oldest federal agents in the country, believe it or not, worked for the post office, an inspection system whose roots trace all the way back to Benjamin Franklin's day, formalized into special agents in the early 1800s, verify dates. They were serious investigators. Mail fraud and mail robbery were their turf, and they guarded it well. But that was the pattern and the problem. Postal inspectors could chase a swindler only if he used a stamp. The Secret Service could chase him only if he printed money. Customs officers could catch him only at a port. Federal law enforcement wasn't a net. It was a scattering of separate threads, and any criminal with a map could walk between them. So by the 1870s, America had a strange arrangement. A tiny corps of marshals stretched across a continent, and a few narrow agencies, each allowed to chase exactly one kind of criminal. Meanwhile, railroads were stitching the country together, and criminals had discovered something wonderful. A state line was a finish line. Rob a bank in one state, cross into the next, and the sheriff behind you legally illegally dissolved like smoke. Into that vacuum stepped a private businessman, and for the next 40 years, the closest thing America had to an FBI was a corporation. His name was Alan Pinkerton. Pinkerton, a Scottish immigrant barrel maker who stumbled into detective work by accident. In the late 1840s, while cutting wood for barrel staves on a small island in the Fox River in Illinois, Pinkerton found the remains of a campfire in a place no honest person had reason to be. Curious, he staked it out and helped local authorities capture a gang of counterfeiters using the island as a base. The barrel maker discovered he loved the hunt. By 1850, he had founded his own detective agency in Chicago under a logo that would enter the language itself, a wide open eye, above the motto, "We never sleep." It's where we get the phrase, "private eye." Pinkerton was, by the standards of his day, a genuine innovator. He built centralized files of criminals' faces and methods, a rogues gallery, decades before police departments did anything similar. And in 1856, he did something almost unthinkable. He hired a widow named Kate Warren as a full detective, arguably the first female detective in America, after she walked into his office and argued that a woman could go places and hear things no male agent ever could. She was right. In February 1861, Warren and Pinkerton pulled off the case that made the agency legendary. Investigating threats against the railroad lines into Washington, Pinkerton's operatives became convinced that President-elect Abraham Lincoln would be attacked while changing trains in Baltimore, a secessionist-leaning city seething with plots. Their solution was pure theater. Warren booked the rear berths of a night train out of Philadelphia for her invalid brother, and Lincoln, hunched, wrapped, traveling under an assumed identity with his famous height folded into a sleeping berth, rolled through Baltimore in the dead of night while the conspirators, if they existed, waited for a public parade that never came. The press mocked Lincoln mercilessly for sneaking into his own capital, but he arrived alive. It's important to say that historians still debate how real or how organized the Baltimore plot actually was. Some argue Pinkerton, never allergic to publicity, inflated the danger. But real or embellished, the episode announced a new fact of American life. If you wanted something seriously investigated, you didn't call the government. You hired the eye. And business was very, very good. The railroads hired Pinkertons. The express companies hired Pinkertons. Banks hired Pinkertons. By the 1890s, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency's active agents and on-call reserves were reported to outnumber the standing army of the United States. Verify the comparison. Widely cited, roughly 2,000 agents and tens of thousands of reservists against a federal army of under 30,000. Think about that. The largest investigative force in America, arguably in the world, was a private company, answerable not to voters or courts, but to whoever signed the check. And that fact was about to curdle into something dark in a farmhouse in Missouri. After the Civil War, the James Younger Gang, Confederate guerrillas turned bank and train robbers led by the brothers Frank and Jesse James, became the most famous outlaws in America. The railroads and express companies they robbed did exactly what everyone did. They hired the Pinkertons. In March 1874, a young agent named Joseph Witcher, verify spelling, sometimes rendered Witcher, arrived in Clay County, Missouri, posing as a farmhand looking for work near the James family farm. His body was found the next day, shot through the head and heart. That same month, 2 more operatives died in a roadside gunfight with the Younger brothers that also killed John Younger. For Alan Pinkerton, it stopped being a case and became a blood feud. And on the night of January 25, 1875, that feud produced the agency's darkest hour. Pinkerton men surrounded the Missouri farmhouse of Zerelda Samuel, Samuel, the mother of Frank and Jesse James, acting on a tip that the brothers were home. They weren't. In the darkness, the raiders threw an iron incendiary device through the kitchen window. It exploded in the fireplace. The blast tore apart the hand and forearm of Zerelda Samuel. Her arm was amputated below the elbow, and mortally wounded her 8-year-old son Archie, Jesse's half-brother, a boy who had robbed no trains and held up no banks. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Newspapers that had condemned the James Gang now thundered against corporate mercenaries bombing a mother in her kitchen. The Missouri legislature came within a handful of votes of passing a resolution offering the gang amnesty, verify vote details, and Jesse James, a killer by any honest accounting, was reborn in the public imagination as a persecuted folk hero. Now, the sober correction. Pinkerton denied to his death that the device was a bomb, insisting it was an illuminating flare, and historians still argue about the intent, though surviving correspondence in which Pinkerton wrote of wanting to destroy the house does him no favors. Verify characterization of the letters. But intent almost didn't matter. The lesson the public absorbed was simple and lasting. Private police, unleashed and unaccountable, will eventually do something like this. And 17 years later, they did it again, at industrial scale. In July 1892, during a bitter lockout at Andrew Carnegie's steelworks in Homestead, Pennsylvania, the company's chairman, Henry Clay Frick, hired 300 armed Pinkerton agents to seize the plant from striking workers. They came at dawn on covered barges, towed up the Monongahela River, Monongahela, and the town was waiting. What followed was a 12-hour pitched battle between American workers and a private army. Rifle fire, burning oil poured toward the barges, even a small cannon. By the time the Pinkertons surrendered and were marched through a gauntlet of enraged townspeople, roughly 10 men were dead, most of them workers. Verify exact toll, commonly cited as 7 workers and 3 agents. The country was horrified, and the violence wasn't finished. Less than 3 weeks later, an anarchist named Alexander Berkman walked into Frick's Pittsburgh office and shot and stabbed him at his desk. Frick, in one of the Gilded Age's most chilling displays of composure, survived, helped subdue his attacker, finished the day's paperwork, and was back at work within weeks. Congress held hearings into the whole affair, and in 1893 passed the Anti-Pinkerton Act, barring the federal government itself from hiring such organizations. Several states went further and restricted them outright. So take stock of the scoreboard at the century's end, because it's bleak. The private option, the Pinkertons, was now politically radioactive, permanently stained by a dead child in Missouri and dead steelworkers in Pennsylvania, a force that had too often functioned as muscle for whoever paid. And the moral acknowledgement here is unavoidable. For workers, immigrants, and the poor, the era's most powerful investigators weren't neutral referees. Justice, like everything else, was for sale. And the public option? It was a handful of marshals doing work so dangerous it bordered on suicidal. Nowhere more than in the Indian Territory, modern Oklahoma, a jurisdiction the size of several states, policed for the federal court of Judge Isaac Parker at Fort Smith, Arkansas. Over the decades of that court's reign, more than 100 deputy marshals died in the territory. Verify count. Translate that into today's terms. The entire FBI, an organization of tens of thousands, has lost fewer agents to hostile action in its whole century of existence than that one frontier court lost deputies in a generation. Verify comparison against FBI service martyr rolls. Wearing a federal badge in the territory wasn't a career, it was a wager. Which brings us to a man who deserves to be far more famous than he is. Bass Reeves, rhymes with leaves, was born enslaved in Arkansas in 1838, escaped to the Indian Territory during the Civil War, and in 1875 was hired as a deputy U.S. Marshal, one of the first black deputies west of the Mississippi. Over 32 years, according to his biographer, the historian Art T. Burton, Reeves arrested more than 3,000 people. He worked in disguise, as a preacher, a cowboy, a drifter, once walking 28 miles posing as a tramp to infiltrate an outlaw hideout. He killed 14 men in gunfights, was reportedly never wounded, and could not read the warrants he served. He memorized them, and in the detail that tells you everything about the man, when his own son Benny was charged with murdering his wife, Reeves insisted on serving the warrant himself and brought him in. One man, 3,000 arrests. That was the actual federal system, not an institution, but a scattering of individually extraordinary people holding a continent together with willpower. And here's a fascinating detail most people don't realize. Even as late as 1900, when the Department of Justice, the government's own law department, needed a crime investigated, it had no investigators of its own at all. None. It had to go hat in hand to the Treasury and borrow Secret Service agents, like a neighbor borrowing a ladder, which worked fine, right up until the borrowed agents started investigating Congress. In the early 1900s, federal prosecutors in Oregon uncovered a scheme almost majestic in its brazenness. Rings of speculators using fake homestead claims to loot millions of acres of public timberland, with paperwork greased by bribed officials. The Justice Department borrowed Secret Service men, including a bulldog operative named William J. Burns, and the trail led upward and upward, until in 1905 it reached the United States Senate itself. Senator John H. Mitchell of Oregon, a fixture of the state's politics for decades, was convicted of taking payments to expedite the fraudulent claims. He never served his sentence. He died months later, while his appeal was pending, of complications from a tooth extraction, surely one of history's least dignified exits for a fallen senator. A sitting congressman from Oregon was convicted too. You might expect Congress to respond with a wave of anti-corruption reform. That is not what happened. What much of Congress took away from the Oregon land fraud cases was something closer to alarm, the realization that the executive branch could point borrowed detectives at them. The predator had noticed it could be prey, so in the spring of 1908, Congress made its move, and it backfired more spectacularly than almost any law in American history. The move itself was small, a rider quietly attached to an appropriations bill in May 1908, banning the Treasury from lending Secret Service agents to any other department. No loans, no borrowing, effective with the new fiscal year that July. On paper, a bookkeeping rule. In practice, it stripped the Department of Justice of every investigator it had. But listen to the floor debate, because the arguments were anything but small. They were the founders' old nightmare, awake and speaking. One congressman warned that no system of spying and espionage on the people, of the kind that prevailed in Russia, would be tolerated in America. Verify quote and attribution, often credited to Representative Walter III Smith of Iowa. Another declared that he could recall no government in history that had perished for lack of a secret service, but many that had perished from the spy systems they built. Verify quote, commonly attributed to Representative J. Swagger Shirley of Kentucky, Sway-Gur Shirley. This was Fouché's ghost. Remember him? Summoned onto the floor of the House. The argument that a federal detective force was the seat of a police state, and that it was better to let some crimes go unsolved than to plant it. President Theodore Roosevelt, who had built his reputation smashing corruption, was incandescent. He said publicly, what everyone privately understood, that the chief argument in favor of the restriction was that congressmen did not want to be investigated themselves. Verify exact wording. The substance appears in his December 1908 annual message. Congress, in turn, accused him of behaving like an emperor. Which brings us to the punchline this entire story has been building toward. Because Roosevelt's Attorney General, the man now legally cut off from borrowing detectives, was a reform-minded Baltimore aristocrat named Charles Joseph Bonaparte, B.O.H. Naparte. And yes, that Bonaparte. He was the grandnephew of Napoleon himself, grandson of Napoleon's youngest brother, who had scandalized Europe by marrying a Baltimore merchant's daughter. The republic founded in terror of Napoleon-style state police was about to receive its national detective force from a literal Bonaparte. History doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it winks, and Bonaparte himself is worth a moment because he was nobody's caricature of a scheming spymaster. He was a Harvard-trained lawyer, a fastidious civic reformer who had spent decades crusading against patronage and municipal corruption in Baltimore, the kind of man who believed sincerely and a little primly that government should be honest and that honest government needed the tools to prove dishonesty. Earlier in 1908, he had asked Congress, openly and through the front door, for a small permanent detective force in the Justice Department. Congress had refused him flat. Then it passed the rider taking away his borrowed agents too. So Bonaparte read the new law carefully, read it like the appellate lawyer he was, and found what Congress had left open. The law said he couldn't borrow agents. It said nothing whatsoever about hiring his own, and the Justice Department's general appropriation contained funds he could lawfully spend on exactly that. It was the kind of loophole you could argue was an accident, or argue Congress should have seen. But it was real, and it was legal. So he waited for Congress to adjourn for the summer and scatter home, out of Washington's swamp heat. Then, with the Capitol quiet, he acted. In late June 1908, he ordered the creation of a small force of special agents inside the Department of Justice. A few dozen men, around 34 in the earliest roster, verify count, including a corps of former Secret Service operatives, verify number transferred. And on July 26, 1908, he issued the order directing Justice Department attorneys to refer their investigations to this new force, under an official named Stanley W. Finch. That date, July 26, 1908, is the day the FBI itself counts as its birthday. It's worth pausing on how it arrived. No founding statute, no vote, no debate. A memo signed in a Washington summer while the legislature was out of town. The force didn't even have a name. It was simply the Special Agent Force, until the following March, when the next Attorney General, George Wickersham, christened it the Bureau of Investigation. When Congress returned and discovered what had happened, there was fury. Hearings, denunciations, dark warnings, and then the quiet ratification that follows so many fates accomplice, fait accompli, French for accomplished facts, things done before anyone can object. Congress funded it anyway. There was too much fraud, too much interstate crime, too much work only such a force could do. The dam hadn't burst. It had been drilled through neatly from the inside. And the aftermath only accelerated. In 1910, the Mann Act against transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes handed the young Bureau its first broad jurisdiction, a law, it must be said, that was soon notoriously stretched and selectively enforced. Verify framing. The prosecution of boxer Jack Johnson is the standard example. The First World War added espionage and sabotage to its portfolio, and the Bureau swelled. In 1924, a 29-year-old Justice Department lawyer named J. Edgar Hoover was appointed to run it, and would not let go for 48 years, a story of accumulated, unaccountable power that deserves and will get its own video. In 1935, the agency took the name it carries today, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So who was right back on the House floor in 1908? Honestly, both sides, and that's not a dodge. The congressmen thundering about spy systems were partly protecting their own hides from corruption probes. Roosevelt was right about that. But their warning that a federal investigative force would one day be turned against political enemies, dissidents, and ordinary citizens was not paranoia. It was prophecy, one that decades later, congressional investigators of a different era would confirm in painful detail. The trouble with slippery slope arguments is that some slopes really are slippery and some aren't, and you only find out by sliding. When you zoom out and look at this whole arc, from 13 Marshals to a corporate detective empire to a memo signed in an empty Capitol, one theme runs through all of it. America never actually decided to create a national police force. It backed into one. For 132 years, the country kept choosing, deliberately, to leave a hole at the center of its law enforcement because it feared what might grow there. And then, crisis by crisis, fake money, unreachable outlaws, private armies, corrupted senators. It filled the hole anyway, not with a grand founding debate, but with improvisations that hardened into institutions. The system you live under wasn't designed. It accreted. And you do live under it. If you've ever started a job that required a background check, bought a firearm, and waited on the instant check system that processes millions of queries a year, verify current volume, been fingerprinted, or watched any news story that begins, "Federal investigators say," you are touching the direct descendant of those 34 unnamed agents hired during a congressional recess. The invisible assumption of modern American life, that somewhere there exists a national force that can follow a crime across any state line, is younger than the light bulb, younger than the automobile, younger than some trees in your neighborhood. Was the old world better? It's genuinely tempting to romanticize it. A republic so suspicious of power that it would rather let outlaws run than build a Fouché. But that world also let Pinkertons bomb a farmhouse and shoot down steelworkers, let corruption fester until a senator sold public land by the million acres and put its federal muscle behind returning human beings to slavery. And the new world, the one with the FBI in it, brought competence and reach, and in time, secret files on civil rights leaders and abuses that vindicated the men of 1908. Whether that trade was worth making depends entirely on what you value, the dangers of the crimes a government cannot solve, or the dangers of the government that can solve anything. Because here is where the story refuses to end. The question Congress asked in 1908, the one Roosevelt mocked, and the one that created the FBI by accident, has never been answered. It has only been inherited. Every confirmation hearing, every subpoena fight, every argument you've ever seen about whether an investigation is justice or persecution is the same argument, wearing modern clothes. A nation needs investigators. Investigators are power, and power always, eventually, gets pointed at someone. So the question stands, as open today as it was in that summer of 1908, who investigates the investigators, and who decides? If this story changed how you see the machinery humming under American life, subscribe. This channel is for people who want to go deep on the hidden systems that shape your world. The courts, the money, the agencies, the quiet memos, the structures most people live inside their whole lives without ever once looking at directly. And there's another one of those hidden systems, one you carry in your pocket every single day, that we're opening up next. You will not want to miss it.